Once they enter the workforce, the British are amongst the worst idlers in the world. This is a quote from Britannia Unchained, written by Liz Truss, Dominic Raab and Kwesi Kwarteng. It's a kind of lazy comment you might hear down the pub. But, given the UK's very poor productivity record, is it a valid question to say, does a nation's approach to work affect productivity? Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp certainly thinks so. He says he worked very hard all his life. Why can't all Britons just be like him? And if we look at global attitudes to work, the UK does actually stand out. The UK is the least likely to say work is important in their life, just 73%. On the question of whether work should come first, the UK is third from bottom, with just 22% agreeing that. Going back to Britannia Unchanged, the authors continue, whereas Indian children aspire to be doctors and businessmen, the British are more interested in football and pop music. But valuing things in life other than work doesn't make you lazy or low productivity, it just makes your life more balanced. Firstly, in terms of hours worked, it's not true to say the UK works fewer hours. The UK works more hours than France, Denmark and Germany, all countries with higher living standards and higher productivity. In fact, productivity in France is 17% higher than the UK, despite French attitudes to work being very different. The French, more likely to go on strike, they retire 4 years earlier, they have longer holidays, shorter working week, they enjoy long social lunches with other work colleagues, and that stands in a big contrast to the UK where workers tend to have a snatched sandwich whilst working through lunch. The French also have very strong labour market protection, which in theory increases the cost of hiring and firing. Yet somehow French productivity is really quite a lot higher than the UK. Perhaps it's partly, longer holidays, so workers are more motivated to get things done in a shorter time period. And happy workers can be productive workers, and I would say that's a key thing. If you're happy at work, if you're motivated, then you're going to do a better job. Another difference between the UK and France is that French degrees tend to be more business oriented, what business actually need. UK degrees tend to be more intellectual, arts based, without a target to what business needs from a graduate. Another interesting comparison that springs to mind is Japanese companies. I remember back in the 80s and 90s when we looked at the Japanese economic miracle, and one thing that people often said was how loyal Japanese workers to their company. They'd go in early, sing the company song, work 14 hours a day, no complaints at all. And certainly in their heyday when the Japanese economy was growing at 5%, we could admire this model from a distance. But since then, of course, things have changed a lot. Japan's economy is somewhat stagnated, and that worker culture has kind of become almost a negative thing because the long contracts have created a surplus of workers with not that much to do. And so it no longer looks as good as it used to. And in fact, Japan has the lowest productivity in the G7. Now in the UK, one trend that is concerning is the rise in inactivity rates. This is people neither working nor looking for work. According to the ONS, inactivity rates have risen to over 9 million, and this is especially a problem amongst young people. Rates of NEET, young people not in education, employment or training, has risen in recent years. In total in the UK, there are 11 million adults are not in work at all, either unemployed, education, sickness, looking after other family members or early retirement. But before we get carried away by a fear that people no longer want to work, the Resolution Foundation argue that ONS stats are actually just very unreliable. The ONS state inactivity at 37%, the Resolution Foundation claim it's closer to 36%, the long-term average. Ironically, ONS data is becoming unreliable because people are unwilling, you could even say too lazy, to fill in the labour force survey. Last year, just 17% responded to the labour force survey. COVID, working from home, means that ONS has a lot of incomplete data, and it's hard to know what's actually happening in the labour market. But what is uncontested is there has been an increase in long-term sickness, and this is a big cause for concern. And actually the growth in long-term sickness is often coming from young people. Why are more young people signing off sick? Is it because of a genuine increase in health conditions since COVID, more mental health problems? Is it a change in attitudes? Or is it the benefit system which has created more of an incentive to become diagnosed as sick rather than unemployed? Well, since 2019, there's been a 55% increase in sickness absence rates, a much higher rate of people being diagnosed with mental health problems. Now, the pandemic not only exacerbated many health conditions, but also shifted something in our attitude to work, working from home, having paid leave and things like that. However, the average number of days lost to sickness is still just 7.8 days a year. It's worth bearing in mind that UK sick pay is amongst the lowest in Europe and offers little financial support. It's no free meal phoning in sick in the UK. Now, is it true that the younger generation have a very different attitude to work, and this should be a cause for concern? On the question of whether it's good to place less emphasis on work, 52% of Gen Z agree. If you compare that to the pre-war generation, there it's just 22% who say it's a good thing to place less emphasis on work. At least some Gen Z influencers talk about quiet quitting, minimal effort, acting their wage. But we have to be careful that a few loudmouths on social media is not necessarily conclusive evidence. I asked my subscribers whether they thought work effort was a reason for poor productivity in the UK. 48% disagreed strongly, but 35% agreed to some extent. Now, I do agree it's hard to disentangle, and there are other factors like low investment, technological growth, service sector-based economy, which are probably much bigger factors, and it'd be worth a video all on the reasons for low productivity. But an interesting view that came up quite a bit was that often people felt there was a very poor incentive to work harder in their job because it wasn't rewarded by their company. The best way to get better pay was actually often just to leave, get a new job. Certainly the corporate culture can make a big difference to incentives and work ethic. And there's a big difference, I know, between being self-employed and being a small cog in a giant corporation. When the buck stops with you, definitely it can increase motivation. Also, going back to the different attitudes of young and old, one reason for growing inactivity is actually early retirement. People in their 50s who own their own house, paid off their mortgage, are in a completely different financial situation to a young person in their 20s who have to pay a fortune in rent. On the question of how important work is in your life, Gen X and Gen Z says 89% and 82%. For baby boomers, it's just 49%. In other words, baby boomers have that luxury of placing less emphasis on work. For the younger generation, work is important out of necessity to meet the cost of living. The young generation face innumerable challenges: student debt, house prices 8 times income, a difficult job market, fairly stagnant real wages. Outside London, the IFS state 42% of graduates are working in a non-graduate job. But jobs are not often there, so it's not surprising that at least some workers feel motivated, leave university, a lot of debt, but you can't even get a job to match your degree. So are British workers lazy? Well, as I was pondering this video, I spent the day observing people working. People collecting the bins, delivery drivers who always seem in a huge rush, visiting a friend in hospital, manic energy at A&E, I can tell you, barristers in a cafe. I can't say I saw any laziness at all. I just saw people working really hard. If anything, I observed that some workplaces are actually understaffed. My favourite cafe just employed 2 people when it opens up, and they struggle to keep on top of everything. Customers pile in, they don't have time to pick up empties and clean tables. So there's no laziness there, despite them probably working for pretty close to a minimum wage. And that's true for many service sector based retail and hospitality places. The only time I really encountered lazy workers was when I was working at my old college, and a self-proclaimed anarchist went to huge lengths to try to avoid doing any work. I found it really tiring working with him. It was much more satisfying to be able to do a job properly. And it is relevant that the people around you have a big influence on your own productivity and work effort. If there's a good spirit in your workplace, then it definitely makes it much easier to work hard. But if there are many slackers, then it's hard to fight that culture. So the culture that's created by a business, by a firm, by the managers, is one of the big factors in determining whether people can work hard and do meaningful work and help increase productivity. One other anecdote worth mentioning, that I've got a friend who works in a call centre in a management position. He says it's a really mixed bag. Very difficult job dealing with irate customers. Many people work really hard, but there is a phenomenon of people working from home and perennially calling in sick. And it's very hard to fire people. And this kind of subgroup of workers, they kind of go from job to job, wait until they get fired. So they kind of abuse the system, but it is quite a small percentage. If there is any real laziness, perhaps it's amongst the ultra wealthy who can live off their dividends and income. House of Lords attendance is not particularly great either. Now, what about the question, does the benefit system encourage people to not work? In 2024, there were 4 million on means-tested benefits with no requirement to work. It has been argued that a crackdown on unemployment benefits has encouraged many to move into more expensive health-related benefits. Policy in practice said that previous reforms had created a structural incentive to claim incapacity benefits, with people on universal credit gaining over $4,000 a year more if they are long-term sick, with no sanctions for not accepting a job. But also, it's not straightforward. The IFS have found that the benefit system has actually become better at encouraging people to go from benefits to part-time work. In 1997, low earners with children had an effective tax rate of 50% after tax and benefits if they moved from benefits to part-time work. In 2023, that effective tax rate is just 38%. But the IFS also state there's still a very big disincentive going from part-time to full-time work. In 1997, the effective tax rate was 52%. Now it's as high as 58%. So we are getting some people into poorly paid part-time work, but there's still a gap in getting people into higher paid full-time work. So does the work effort and work ethic affect productivity? Well, it does to some extent. It's not easy to measure, and a lot of this does come down to corporate culture, how good your manager is, the other workers around you. And I think it's something that can't be easily influenced by government policy. It's more determined by the actual firm that you work in. Also, I do actually kind of like the fact that UK workers say that work isn't the only thing in life, because I think that sometimes we tend to put on a pedestal economic growth and productivity, ignoring more important things. And this video looks at whether the obsession with economic growth is actually healthy for society and people. So do check it out. Thanks a lot.